I do have one piece of good news today. So, remember a couple of weeks ago, I went over to Podcast Movement in Dallas. This is sort of personal piece of good news, but I think it has some larger consequences for the American public debate. So you'll remember that it was a national news story because I went over to this conference called Podcast Movement. We had bought a booth over there, and I just walked the floor. I happened to be in town for actually another event, and my people were like, do you want to come in? Do you want to say hello? I went and I walked the floor a little bbit. And Podcast Movement then put out this abject apology for my presence. They said that my very presence, my very existence was threatening to some people. And they couldn't, and they regretted the harm that it had caused. Well, yesterday, finally, they decided that they were going to back off of that. So they put out a statement suggesting that they were apologizing for that. They said, quote, as we stated, we're continuing to evaluate our policies and guiding social media and events with inclusivity, diversity, and respect for all. We have to start by sincerely apologizing to Mr. Shapiro for our reaction when he visited a booth we sold his company. That wasn't right. So that is a good sign. That's a good sign for America. When people back off of censorious viewpoints, that is a very good. In fact, this may be the first time I've actually seen a significant company back off on censorious viewpoint thanks to blowback from people, not just on the right, but in the center. The people who said this is ridiculous. You can't do this. You can't just call yourself a sort of pro-free speech, pro-diversity of viewpoint event and then ban the biggest podcaster on the political right and the biggest political podcast in the country. You can't do that. And so good for Podcast Movement. Again, no hard feelings. That's the way this works. If you do the right thing, then we praise you. And if you do the wrong thing, then we smack you. And Podcast Movement backed off. And I think that actually is a good sign for the country. Because again, if we're going to have any shared values, one of those values has to be the ability of people to speak freely on a variety of political topics, even if we disagree with them. I know that that's a hard one for many people on the left, but it also happens to be incredibly valuable. So whenever there's a victory in the business sphere about that, as we just saw with Podcast Movement, that is worthy of praise. And thanks also to our allies and our business partners over at Cumulus, who had essentially told Podcast Movement they continued along these lines. They were going to pull their money and they would stop sponsoring Podcast Movement. Good for Podcast Movement for recognizing the failure of the principles that they had suggested they actually believed in. And I'm glad that they've reverted back to a more free speech appropriate attitude. I hope you enjoyed that clip from The Ben Shapiro Show. If you did, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you stay up to date with all our future content.